to introduce a dear friend, philosopher, and guide, Marvin Zonis. Marvin taught me in 1988 when I was in Chicago. I discovered my papers from his class number 482, Politics in a World of Interdependent Economies. He gave me a C in my class report, and he said it was crap. But we still remain friends. And I remember in 1988, when I was deciding whether I should come back to India or stay on in the US, I told him I wanted to talk to him. He said, come to my office. And I went across to his office and I started talking. And within 5 minutes, he told me, Louis, go home to India. And that actually was one of the nudges that I needed to sort of start on an incredible journey for the last 30 years. So Marvin actually taught at other parts of the university, and he came to Chicago Booth in 1988, and he taught courses on international political economy, political risk, and business leadership. Today's talk is on the risks of conflicts across the globe are greater than in decades. In 1988, Marvin talked to us about Afghanistan, and he said Afghanistan is going to be a huge problem. And a lot of us said, what's the big deal about Afghanistan? No one cares about it. And then 9/11 happened, and everybody knew about Afghanistan. So he's had the ability to talk about things that, we don't see today. He just turned 84 last week, and I hope that I'm at 84 as alert as he is. He was the first professor at a business school to teach a course on the effects of digital economies on global businesses. He consulted to corporations and professional asset management firms throughout the world, helping them identify, assess, and manage their political risk in a changing global environment. In fact, there's a story behind this t-shirt. This t-shirt is 21 years old, and it was given to me by a bunch of his students when they came on an assignment funded by Anderson Consulting, I think, and it's called Team India 1999. He would send students across the world to study specific topics across it. And I still have this t-shirt. It's good quality, Marvin. You had good funding by your sort of sponsors.
Right.
And he was on the board of advisors for the Comptroller General of the United States at the GAO. He's been on the board of CNA Financial. He's been a fellow of PwC Advisory Services. And he's written extensively. I urge you guys to get onto his mailing list. And he sends a newsletter, which is interesting and is for free. Marvin's also been a leading authority on the Middle East and has spent the last 50 years studying the region and Islam. The Shah of Iran was somebody he knew. He's been the president of the American Institute of Iranian Studies. He's lived in Iran, or as he says, Iran. He's hitchhiked all over Afghanistan and Pakistan. He studied at Yale, he studied at Harvard Business School, and I think he got his PhD at MIT. And he's also studied at the Institute for Psychoanalysis in Chicago. Our kids know him, which is why they're attending this talk, because they're great fans of his. Our son is in Chicago, and they love both him and his wife, Lucy. And many years ago, I asked him whether he'd come to India and speak at our investor conference in Mumbai. And our investors still remember the great talk he did. And the reason why I asked Marvin to talk is because he invariably says something nice about me, even though he didn't like the paper that I wrote way back in 1988. And I'm going to end with something which a more famous student of his said. Satya Nadella, who is the CEO of Microsoft, was asked about 5 years ago, regarding the Chicago style thinking, is there a booth class that was particularly memorable? Remember, this is the CEO of Microsoft. And this was his response. It was a class that I took with Professor Marvin Zonis on leadership. He stressed that EQ trumps IQ in the long run, that E is for empathy. And with that, Marvin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Louis. I'm touched by your introduction. How's the sound, everybody? Can you hear me? Couple of Just a couple of notes before I begin. One is, do go to my website, marvinzonis.com, marvinzonis.com, and enter your email, and you'll be on my mailing list for my periodic distributions about which Louis just spoke. And you don't have to read them if you get them and you don't like them, and you can feel free to unsubscribe anytime you like. And as we say in the United States, the price is right, $0. So you might like to see some of these thoughts I have, or articles I deem important, which other people have written, which I send out. Well, the second thing I'd like to say is that my relationship with Louis, which began in 1988 and has continued to the present, has been as meaningful for me as Louis just described it has been meaningful for him. And we have remained close friends. We remain in touch for a variety of reasons over the years since his graduation from Chicago in 1989. And I don't have to tell you how proud I am personally, but how proud Booth School of Business is at the contributions which Louis has made to the development of his country, which he loves deeply, and to the betterment of the Indian people. And so this has been a very touching relationship to me because of the service which Louis has committed to his country, and, it must be said, to the service which his wife, Fiona, also commits on a daily basis, both deeply involved now in not-for-profit activities in India. The final thing I want to say in introduction is, remember what I've already said to you, which is, please, if there's confusion, if there's disagreement, you really liven up our conversation. If you didn't wait till the end in order to wave your hand and get recognized, and let's have the discussion at the point of my saying something that wasn't clear or that with which you disagree, and that would be great. You'd stimulate this talk, make it much more interesting. So I want to talk about risks to the global economy in the form of geopolitical risks, in terms of what is it that leads to conflict, and what conflicts might we see in the near future? Where do conflicts come from, and what are the most likely candidates to disintegrate into conflict? And you know, I am sure that when you think about the sources of conflict between countries, there are examples which leap to mind, which sort of establish categories of kinds of conflict. So I'll give you an example. Twice, Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring countries. So he invaded Iran in September of 1980. And he did that in order to try to steal Iranian oil fields, which were in the southwest of the country, and that is to say, adjacent to the existing border with Iraq. And so Saddam was trying to increase his wealth by stealing oil fields from other people. So the idea of acquiring natural resources, new source of wealth, etc., is an example of conflicts which occur quite frequently. And indeed, Saddam, remember, had done it twice, because he also invaded Kuwait to take over the entire oil industry of Kuwait. And there was only a United Nations effort led by the United States which forced Saddam out of Kuwait. Failing in Kuwait, he then went and tried to invade Iran. So that's a typical kind of class of conflict. I'll give you another example of a class of conflict, and that is oftentimes members of one nationality are located in a cluster in the territory of a different country than the nationality they represent. And countries often feel the need to invade a country in order to protect the members of their own nationality. So we've seen so many examples of that. For example, there are pockets within the independent Republic of Georgia, which are inhabited by Russians, and the Russian state has invaded Georgia to prevent the government of Georgia from exercising authority over its territories in which Russians live. And to this day, there are now enclaves within Georgia, which are really in effect controlled by Russia, because there are pockets of Russians living in those enclaves. Another example, of course, is Russia coming to the aid of Russians living in eastern Ukraine, in two provinces in the east of Ukraine, which are inhabited entirely by Russian-speaking people, and insisting that those two provinces of Ukraine either be independent or be part of Russia itself. So that's entirely separate from the class of conflicts that come from natural resources. We know of a third class of conflicts, which should be on everyone's mind, and that is the idea that there's a piece of territory in one country that justly belongs to another country. And that would be, for the best example of that, of course, is the Crimea, the province of Ukraine on the southern tip of Ukraine in the Black Sea, which Nikita Khrushchev, who was from Ukraine, gave to Ukraine from Russia. I believe it was, I don't remember now, was it back in 1962, and which upon his death and later on, Russia said that was unfairly done, shouldn't have been given to Ukraine. It was historically part of Russia and it should remain part of Russia. And in 2014, Vladimir Putin sent in the troops and conquered and seized the Crimea to make it part of Russian territory, despite its being attached to Ukraine. So there are these typical sources of conflict with which we are all familiar. There are obviously many others. For example, why did the Japanese attack the United States at Pearl Harbor in 1941, December 7th? And the answer is because the United States had imposed sanctions on Japan to deny Japan sources of oil, given that Japan had invaded China and seized Manchuria and was moving further south into China. The United States imposed sanctions on oil, which obviously Japan desperately needed for its military, and to try to break out of the sanctions, acquire oil, Japan decided, disastrously, obviously, in retrospect, that it would make a sneak attack against the United States to destroy its Pacific naval fleet which was based in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and that would allow Japan to then dominate the Pacific. Well, they did destroy a lot of naval equipment, but not enough, and the United States rebuilt, and Japan was defeated. But nonetheless, it was another attempt, another typical source of conflict, turned out to be. Well, I don't want to talk about those today. You all know about those. They're all pretty obvious. What I want to talk about today is something very different. I want to talk about something that I believe is today the greatest source of interstate conflict. And I want to alert you to this source of conflict, help explain the source of conflict to you and why it is so important. And I believe, in addition to being its principal source of global conflict, this idea is also extraordinarily important in interpersonal conflict, in relationships among your individuals, and in your relationships with your friends and your family and the people with whom you have to deal, whether it's in the workplace or not in the workplace. And I think as you proceed through the Indian School of Public Policy, and as you graduate, and as hopefully you acquire significant positions related to public policy, whether it be analyzing public policy, whether it be enacting public policy, whether it be carrying out public policy, I hope the ideas that I am going to leave with you this morning will be crucial to improving your ability to be effective in the jobs you take on for the betterment of your own country. And I agreed to do this talk, not so much because the pay is great, zero, and not so much because I felt an obligation to Lewis, although I always do feel an obligation to Lewis, but because I believe that the School of Public Policy is a crucial good for the future of India. I just can't imagine right now what could be better for India than effective public policy. So I congratulate you for attending the school, and I hope what I'm about to tell you has some significant relationship to your futures as public policy specialists. So let me see if I can get my slides up here. All right, can you see my slides? Good, Louis, thanks. So I do believe that we are at a stage in global politics in which the risks of conflict are really just staggeringly great. And the way I want to begin to understand this is through emotional factors. Lewis mentioned that, let me give you a little background and amplify what Lewis had said. I arrived at the University of Chicago, and I can't even believe this because it was so long ago. I arrived at the University of Chicago to teach in the political science department, to teach Middle Eastern politics in the fall of 1966. So I taught for over 50 years at the University of Chicago. I had started to study the Middle East in a serious way in 1960. I lived in Iran from 1963 to 66. I came back to MIT where I worked on my thesis. I got a job at the University of Chicago. I came to teach Middle Eastern politics. So after about 15 years of studying the Middle East, I realized that I wasn't getting it. I knew everything there was to know about the Middle East. I didn't understand it. What are these people doing? I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I realized the reason I couldn't figure out what was going on in the Middle East was because I was using the stuff I had learned at the Harvard Business School. I was using the stuff I had learned at MIT in political science. That's not what's going on in the Middle East. What's going on in the Middle East are emotions, are people's feelings, are people's passions, are people's commitments. And I realized I didn't know anything about emotions. So in order to try to understand international politics better, I applied for and was admitted to the Institute for Psychoanalysis in Chicago, where they teach mainline Freudian, you lie in the couch and you do the talking cure, as it's called, where they train psychoanalysts. So I was trained as a psychoanalyst. And I came out of that committed to the idea that emotions are the key issue which one needs to understand if one wants to understand what is going on. One of my teachers was a man named Heinz Kohut. Heinz Kohut was a psychoanalyst. He fled Vienna in 1939. He was Jewish. and he was about to be rounded up by the Nazis. He got himself to Chicago, and it turns out he enrolled at the University of Chicago Psychiatry Department, became a psychiatrist, and then ultimately was trained as a psychoanalyst. And in my judgment, Heinz Kohut is the second most important figure in psychoanalysis in the 20th century after Sigmund Freud. And of course, he was the father of this whole business. And Kohut came up with the idea of the self. And the self is made up of all the emotional, intellectual factors that make an individual out of a person, or make an individual into a distinct person. That's a better way to put it. So the point is, what is it that makes Louis Miranda and not Marvin Zonis? Is that Louis has had a variety of personal experiences from his childhood to the present, that the combination of those experiences and his genetic makeup create a distinctive human being called Louis Miranda. And that concatenation, that cluster of factors that makes him different from me, the self of Louis Miranda, also represents the integrity of Louis Miranda. So that a threat to the self is really a very threat to the integrity of Louis Miranda. In other words, if Louis Miranda or Marvin Zonis or any of you in this call are humiliated, that is perceived as an attack on the integrity of the self. So this is what Kohut claimed, and he developed an entire set of ideas around the self and around an attack on the self or humiliation of the self. So what is a humiliation? Anytime an individual feels disrespected, loses stature, is made to feel shame, is reduced in pride, he fails to recognize the dignity of others, he feels powerless, he's being forced into some situation, he is ridiculed, scorned, treated with contempt, embarrassed. That is a humiliation. So my argument would be that to be humiliated in some one of these many ways is a normal reality of everyday life. I'm humiliated all the time. I mean, I feel that people don't treat me properly. I do something which makes me embarrassed. How could I have said that to that person? I feel reduced. I feel shrunk. I'm not, that's myself has been damaged by my failure to act or by people's failure to act appropriately towards me. So it's not that humiliation occurs once every 6 months or, once every year and a half. Humiliations happen all the time. And if you're lucky, these humiliations aren't powerful. They aren't, overwhelming. You sort of roll with the punch. Can any of you think of, or would you be willing to share with us any time that you've been humiliated recently that you can think of? Try to think of an occasion when you've been humiliated, and if you could share that with us.
Professor Zonis, so I'll try to answer the question. So back in my last job, I had to constantly answer questions that my boss would present, but I was in a group of 5 other people. Every time I'd post an answer or I'll try to answer his question, he would never take my answer. He wouldn't even consider it as an option. So that happened multiple times, and that I felt humiliated at such a situation.
Thank you very much for sharing that. That's a perfect example of humiliation. where you weren't treated with the respect that you believe you deserved, and this guy was a jerk. I mean, how was he going to expect you to perform at any level of competence if he's embarrassing you in front of your colleagues, if he's humiliating you? So if you can all think of humiliation that you may have experienced, that would be good. The next thing to think about is, what did you do when you had been humiliated? You know, that's an interesting question. What's the result of a perceived humiliation? And the argument that Kohut made is that every perceived humiliation is followed by rage. Not just kind of angry, well, I didn't like that. No, rage. I mean, really being angry. And every time one is really angry, you can be sure that there was a humiliation that occurred before that real anger. And so the question is, what's the consequence of the anger? Well, on the one hand, rage can be very productive, because, you know, you can be enraged and then say, I'll show that guy, he thinks I'm no good. I'm going to I'm going to work hard. I'm going to come up with new ideas. I'm going to show him that I can really do it. So if you want to try to prove your worth, or that can be very productive. Or not. Imagine another highly productive way to deal with humiliation, which is, I'm so angry, I'm going to the gym and I'm going to work it off. So, you know, that's a very productive way to deal with anger, is to contribute to your own physical health. Imagine all the negative things there are about humiliation, the rage that follows humiliation, one of which is terribly destructive. In the United States, I don't know what the situation is like in India, but I can tell you that a massive amount of alcoholism in the United States comes from individuals who are enraged. There's a kind of expression in the United States that covers this idea, which is, oh, you're angry? Oh, I need a drink. Let's have a drink. Let's have a drink. And there's a lot of that. And obviously, alcohol is not a good situation for the individual's physical or mental health, but it's one way that people deal with humiliation. So my point is, there is positive results of humiliation. It doesn't have to be all negative. And there are negative consequences of humiliation. And so my argument is that there's a lot more humiliation around, and it has a lot more negative consequences than we can imagine. So, for example, here is a graffito on the wall of a city in Santiago, Chile, and it says, unemployment is humiliation. And that's exactly right. Why? Why is unemployment humiliation? Let me ask you, why is unemployment humiliation? Anybody?
Yeah, Professor, I would like to try that.
Please.
So if you're unemployed, it basically means the society has not thought of you as a worthy person, or the society does not attach a value to you. So that might give you a feeling of humiliation.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, listen, work is a crucial part of human dignity. We all derive meaning. Think about this. Where does meaning in life come from? And I hope all of you are working on the question of how do you get your life to be meaningful. I hope your education is helping. And one answer is, well, there are three sources of meaning. One is religion or faith of some kind. One is family and loved ones, and one is work. And if you don't have work, that's a crucial pillar of the meaning of life and the value you have within a society. So, unemployment, which is very high now in the United States and other countries, in India, unemployment is humiliation, is a form of humiliation. Here's another form of humiliation. Here's the number of days it took for prices to double at the peak of hyperinflation. So the worst hyperinflation, as you can see, occurred in Hungary in 1946, where it took less than 1 day for prices to double. So prices were doubling every 3/4 of a day, or Zimbabwe. You can see what happened in Germany. It took 4¼ days for prices to double in Germany in 1923. So this is a picture of hyperinflation. And why was hyperinflation a humiliation? Because, of course, it destroyed everyone's sense of coherence and of wealth. And no matter what assets you had, they were destroyed in this hyperinflation. And hyperinflation produced huge humiliations with usual internal consequences that were highly negative. And of course, the German consequence, which was the most negative, was that this unemployed postcard painter living in poverty in Vienna in 1923 was able to become the Chancellor of Germany in 1933 because of the humiliation which so many Germans had suffered, both by the loss of World War I and also by the hyperinflation of 1923, and with disastrous consequences. There's another person that experienced profound humiliation. And as you can see, one of the good things he's doing in response to his humiliation is he's working out. This is always a good idea after you've been humiliated. It's good for your mental health and it's good for your physical health. But President Putin, in case you don't think he had been humiliated, is famous for this expression, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Well, it's interesting. If you think back to the 20th century, through a lot of which I lived, how about World War I? How about the influenza epidemic of 1918? How about the hyperinflation I've just been over? How about the big global depression, 1928, 1932? How about World War II? How about the atom bomb? There were a lot of really geopolitical catastrophes in the 20th century. And whereas most people thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a good thing, Putin sees this as a profound humiliation. And he has been striking back ever since. And of course, the president of China is in the same boat as President Putin. And the boat he's in China is a boat that all the leaders of 20th century China have been in. These are the three leaders of China. Sun Yat-sen, who made the revolution in 1911 and had a republic. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader trying to consolidate power and ultimately losing to the communists, and Mao Zedong in 1949. And if you go over every one of those guys, they all said the same thing, and it's the same thing that President Xi says, was that China has experienced profound humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. And of course, I wouldn't argue with them because I think there's a lot of truth to this idea. What's the history of China? Somebody give me the 19th century history of China. You guys remember? I'll tell you what the history of China was. Britain was importing huge amounts of tea from China, running a massive trade deficit with China because Britain wasn't selling anything in China, but only importing tea from China. So the British, in their genius, looked around and said, what are we going to do about this trade deficit? You know, the British were as stupid in the 19th century as Donald Trump is in this week. But I'm trying to control myself. I won't go there right now. Anyhow, so what was the British solution to the trade deficit? The British solution to the trade deficit is, what an idea. We'll grow opium in India, we'll export it to China, and that will eliminate the trade deficit. So Britain and China fought wars in the 19th century called the Opium Wars because the Chinese were trying to forbid the importation of opium into China, appreciating how bad it was for the Chinese people. And Britain won the wars, and Britain acquired, for example, Hong Kong as a prize from one of the victories of the Opium Wars. And so indeed, imagine inflicting the opium addiction on the Chinese people as a solution to a trade deficit. So yes, the Chinese were humiliated, certainly in the 19th century and until recently. Well, the point is that humiliation continues to drive Chinese behavior. So here's a quote from one of the important Chinese intellectuals, and you can read this on your own, in which he talks about unconsciously, the humiliation continues to drive the behavior of Chinese people in the present day, to the present day. On an emotional level, we cannot help but associate treatment in the present with past injuries, defeats, invasions, and occupations. So the humiliation is a powerful force driving China. Here's one example of the way that the humiliation played out. Imagine 3 meters too short, they had to revise the entire visit because the red carpet wasn't long enough, and that represented some kind of humiliation that the British were inflicting once again on China. So these humiliations run deep, they generate rage, and they cause behaviors which are not necessarily driven by rational concerns, but are emotional issues that lead countries to do things that they might not otherwise do. And here's one example which has been, one might say, catastrophic for India. Here's an example of a humiliation that China experienced that's led to the problems that it has today with India, which is Britain forced an agreement on China, which China refused to establish, called the McMahon Line, but which at the time Tibet had enough autonomy to accept. And so the British forced this treaty, and which now, because it was a treaty between Tibet and Britain, India says is the line of control, but China said we never signed this treaty. So that kind of refusal by China, based again on a humiliation, is an example of something that causes present problems. So just to bring this section to a conclusion, to try to illustrate to you how powerful this emotional idea of humiliation is, I want you to see that humiliations don't go away in a minute or two, that the rage has a possibility of being positive. We'll show you, we can come up with good solutions, or but the argument I want to make is, at this moment, the rage from humiliation is now the most powerful factor, or at least one of the most powerful factors driving the risk of conflicts across the globe. And so what I want to do is go over some of these conflicts and show you the power of rage driven by humiliation. Before I do that, let's take a pause, and I want to ask you if there's any comments or questions or ideas. Go ahead, young man.
Yes, Professor. So I wanted to ask a question about manufactured humiliation. Is there such a thing where there isn't any real humiliation when you look at history, but leaders use this as an opportunity to stir up emotions and use it for their own advantage? Is there such a thing as manufactured humiliation? And if so, have we seen it?
There's very definitely manufactured humiliation in which leaders try to stir up the passion of the crowds in order to justify some policy which the leader tries to do. However, in order for it to be effective, there usually has to be at least some modicum of a basis for why people would buy into that leader's claim. And, you know, I don't want to get on tricky grounds here because I don't know as much about this situation as the situation that you know about in your own country, which is the historic, well, I'm thinking of the incidents in which there have been racial or religious wars, I should say, against Muslims in India, stirred up by politicians, which led the crowd to go bananas. But I'll give you a better example right now about something which I know about, which is going on in my own country. And that is that the President of the United States, interested in being reelected in November of this year, is stirring up racial animosity in the United States between whites and blacks and between whites and Latinos as a way to get his base to get off their butts and go to vote. And so he exaggerates, for example, let me put it this way. He conflates, meaning he puts together the idea of black protests against racial injustice with black violence and looting, which has also occurred. So there has been a little of this looting and violence, but Donald Trump would have you believe that every instance of a protest where people, for example, are marching peacefully through a downtown Chicago street with posters saying we demand racial justice, is an example of a fascist, anarchist assault on white people. And that seems to be working. A lot of white people are buying into that. So it helps if there's a little bit of violence, because if there were no violence, then it would be harder for him to make the sale, as we say. But yes, I think there's no question that leaders can exaggerate the intensity and the extent of a humiliation.
Professor, I have a question.
Please.
So can this be applied to the Pakistan's hostile state-sponsored terrorism towards India because of the 1971 humiliating 1971 partition of Eastern and Western Pakistan?
Well, you know, let me answer that with another Freudian, excuse me, another concept. I haven't given you any Freudian concepts yet, but Freud had a very, to me, powerful idea. And Freud referred to it as overdetermination. And the argument that Freud made was that any important decision that an individual makes has more than one cause. And so think about, I don't know, are any of you married? Okay, there's a guy who's married. Think about getting married. You know, when I think about my marriage, which Thank you, Lord, is a good one. When I think about my marriage, I say to myself, why did I marry this woman? And the superficial answer, well, I was in love with her. Well, why? That's not an interesting answer. The question is, yeah, of course. The question is, why were you in love with her? Well, anyhow, I go through the factors that led me to marry this woman, and it turns out that there's more than one. There are many factors that contributed together to make the decision for me. And so that's what he meant by overdetermination. Any significant decision that's made has many components. And so it would be wrong to attribute Pakistan's behavior to one single phenomenon, which is the 1971 humiliation. Remember also that the military is in control of Pakistan. And one of the ways they justify their control of Pakistan is by upplaying a so-called threat from India. So because they can sell the Pakistani people on the idea that India is a constant threat to the future of Pakistan, and look what happened to East Pakistan, we have to be in control, and Imran Khan is not really running the show. We are, but we put him up in front because we need a civilian. That's another factor. They want to justify, in other words, military control of the Pakistani state. Why? Because it's good for the military. I mean, they get big salaries and they have a lot of money to buy their weapons and their nuclear things. So I wouldn't want to say that the humiliation is the only cause. And we could have an interesting discussion about whether it's the definitive cause. But what's important is that I want you to see that it's part of the equation that leads to Pakistani conflict, or Pakistani hostility, I should say, to India. And India has its own issues with Pakistan. I mean, it's fascinating that India remains the largest donor of foreign aid to Afghan's government after the United States. And so India is, very strong in Afghanistan. They donated the parliament building to the Afghan government. And why are they doing that? Well, you may know the reasons better than I, but I'll tell you the way the Pakistanis see it, which is they're going to be, when the United States pulls out, Pakistan's going to be in an Indian sandwich. There's going to be Indian to the south and the southeast. There's going to be India controlling Afghanistan to the northwest, and Pakistan is going to get squeezed in. So, this is a very complex set of relationships here. Any other questions?
Professor Zonis, hi,
Yes.
I have a question.
Hi, Mahika.
Hi.
Hey, I got to know Mahika because she spent a year in Chicago as an intern in a famous Chicago theater company called Steppenwolf. And so I didn't only get the pleasure of knowing her brother, who was a student at the University of Chicago, but I got to know Mahika in her time in Chicago.
It was a good time. You're all really lucky that you'll get to hear from Professor Zonis. Professor Zonis, I had a question. So you're talking about the last few months, especially in the US, there's been a lot of talk about defunding the police, and what that means is to take away money from weaponry and rather use that towards peacemaking and providing police with psychologists and coping mechanisms and teachers to really ease rage and ease unconscious or even conscious reactions that are uncalled for. So is there a scope for this on a grander scale where you're activating psychology to look after these reactions in larger political context, or do you think this is something that is just involuntary and this is just how life is going to continue on?
Yeah, this is a very important political issue in my country right now, and let me say a few more words about it, and then try to answer Mahika's question. And that is that there's been part of Black Lives Matter has been the idea of defunding the police, and of course, a huge controversy has arisen in the United States over what does it mean to defund the police, and the superficial, stupid interpretation of what it means is that if the police have a budget now of $1 billion a year in some big city, let's give them only $800 million a year and they'll have to shrink the size of the police force. This is not what defunding the police is about, although the Republican Party and Donald Trump argued that that's what it's about. What defunding the police is about is to take functions away from the police department, which are not central to the role of policing, and assign them to other agencies better equipped to deal with policing functions. So, think about what is the function of the police? And if you go back into history as to why police were created, the real answer is that police were created in order to protect the integrity of the property of the bourgeoisie. The police were created to protect the integrity of the property of the classes who had enough money to have property from the predations of the lower classes who were trying to steal the property. Well, if you come to America now, the police have so many functions. For example, traffic violations. For example, domestic disputes between members of families. That the police are involved in a tremendous number of issues for which they are not necessarily well trained. And the idea would be in defunding the police to have, for example, a group of people trained to deal with domestic disturbances, as they're called, which usually means fights between husbands and wives or between children and parents, trained to deal with the domestic issues, which the police are not trained to deal with. The police are trained to deal with criminals and the protection of property. Or another example about defending the police is traffic violation. Why are police spending their time stopping speeding cars and giving tickets? This is not a crucial function for police. Let's get somebody else to do that. So that's the real theory behind this. And the idea would be if the police were removed from responsibility for example, intruding into domestic violence cases, they could spend more time being trained more effectively and to deal with real criminal activity. So that's the theory. Now, how it's going to play out will be determined by who gets elected in this country, I'm afraid to say, which is pretty much up in the air right now. If you want to know how appalling Americans are, just think about that the outcome of this election is in doubt when you have a man who is a psychopathic, narcissistic liar running for president. But let's move on. Any other questions? Hey, there's Fiona.
Great, nice. See you, Marvin.
See you, Fiona.
If I may, Professor, is anyone else asking a question? Okay, Professor, you began with the concept of self and humiliation, basically relating to personalities and leaderships. So don't you think in that context, when we usually talk about conflicts, it's only the geopolitical aspect and the security aspect that usually is talked about and discussed. However, the actual overarching aspect is really the things that you spoke, the leadership, the personalities, the ethnicity and identities of those countries, and the issues that arise out of those identities. Aren't those the actual issues that determine conflicts?
I want to be sure I want to be sure I understood what you were asking. Would you kind of repeat the heart of your question?
Sure. What I'm trying to say is, aren't these social identities, aspects like leadership, personalities, are the ones that are actually responsible for conflicts, and not the usual debate around the geopolitics and military and security?
Well, of course, what I want to argue is that a very important factor in moving leaders to seek conflict, a very important factor, not necessarily the only factor, that's overdetermination, not necessarily the determining factor, but an important contribution is this concept of humiliation, that leaders are humiliated. They feel they represent the self of their country, and they feel they have been humiliated by any number of factors, and they are going to strike back. So let me turn to a couple of examples, and then I'll stop again. Let's just take one example. Here are the ones I want to just cover, and there are many, many others, but in the interest of time constraints, I'm just going to talk about these four. And let's just turn to China. I mean, China is, the big guy on the block, as we say in my country. This is numero uno for trouble. And almost everywhere around the periphery of China, there is trouble. Obviously, there's trouble with India. We know that. And then there's trouble all the way around Southeast Asia, East Asia. And it's because of China's new aggression. So let's talk about what's going on with China. First, there's been a staggering increase. Sorry, guys. And let me just take a drink here. There's been a staggering increase in China's military modernization and the extraordinary rise in the capability of China's military, in which they are now spending many times per year on the military than India is spending on the Indian military, and it has produced tremendous military gains for China. So this is just one example of the gain that China has produced. Here is a mobile missile. You see it's being driven around on a truck. It's called the DF-26, and it's known as the Guam Express. And of course, what's the advantage of a mobile missile is China is a very big country. You spread these missiles all over China. You can't find them. You can't destroy them. They go out on the highway and they shoot off the missile right from the truck. Why is it called the Guam Express? Well, if you take a look at your map someday, go to Google Maps or whatever you use in India, and look where the island of Guam is, and you will see how far away in the Pacific Guam is from the Chinese mainland. And the reason it's called the Guam Express is because this missile is meant to land anywhere between the Chinese mainland and the island of Guam, way out in the Pacific, because it is between the Chinese mainland and the island of Guam that American aircraft carriers operate. And so in the event of a conflict between China and the United States, aircraft carriers that went east of Guam, in other words, towards the Chinese mainland, to attack China would be able to be destroyed by China sending up this missile and having it go down and land directly on the deck of an aircraft carrier, an American aircraft carrier, which would mean the American aircraft carriers have to stay west. Sorry, I gave you the wrong directions. West of Guam is dangerous. East of Guam is safe. But the problem with being east of Guam is very far away from the Chinese mainland. So China has been developing this whole new class of weaponry. And you all understand everything, I trust, about weapons, which is there's no such thing as a defensive weapon. Here, you could say, well, China is trying to save itself from American aircraft carriers. But the reality is every weapon system is offensive. If China wants to have conflict, it can then launch these missiles, destroy American aircraft carriers, and have a greater likelihood of succeeding in its conflict because it's been able to destroy American aircraft carriers, or at least keep them so far away from China that China can carry on with its conflict. So there's quite an amazing amount of modernization in China. And by the way, I didn't even mention the aircraft carriers, which China is itself building now. They have 2 aircraft carriers. So, we see this crazy situation. I mean, can you imagine this? I mean, when you are much more familiar with it than I am, but when I read about this, Chinese troops marching with Indian troops 2 feet apart. I mean, is this a formula for conflict or is this a formula for conflict? I mean, this is absolutely madness. And it doesn't seem to be under control right now. Here's another example of my concern about China. So here's a map. Excuse me. Here's a map of China. And you can see Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, etc. And then Indonesia, Malaysia, and on the right you see the Philippines. And suddenly China issues a map. And it never talks about this map. It only shows this map. And it's called a 9-dash line because if you go through the map, turns out that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 red dashes. It's called the 9-dash line. Well, it turns out that when you push Chinese officials, they now claim that all of the territory within the 9 lines belong to China, our sovereign Chinese territory. So it's interesting because the distance from China to Malaysia, or from the bottom red line to China, is 1,000 miles. Nobody recognizes 1,000 miles of sea as a sovereign territory of another country. You know, there's whole issues of whether or not an island drops off or carries on and how far out from that island, whether 12 kilometers, whatever, but 1,000 miles is not in the cards. And these lines define Chinese sovereign territory, which is contradictory to the claims of every one of these riparian countries. Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines in particular claim possession of parts of this territory. And so you know what China's been doing, because you've all been reading about it, which is it goes back to, it takes these islands down here in the Spratly Sea. I guess you can't see this, can you, on my pen on this island? Can you see my pen on this island? No. No, you can't? So it takes these reefs, and it builds up the reefs. And here is a poster. The islands on the South China Sea are part of our beautiful motherland, and these are all over China now. And it shows one of the islands that has been built up from kind of underwater reef into a real island. And as you can see, with a very long runway, which violates further international law about not militarizing islands that are built in the sea. And there are many of those islands. This is Woody Island. You can see the buildings along the runway and radar stations on the island. Further to the right, you can see that white dome. And here's Johnson Island, which has anti-aircraft weapons in the and anti-aircraft rockets, you know, missile batteries that can be aimed at incoming aircraft if they were ever to attack this, quote, Chinese island. So you have here Chinese examples of aggression manifested in the physical transformation of territory in order to seize the right to claim an island on its own, to claim that the South China Sea belongs exclusively to China. And now we have China's security laws extended to Hong Kong, and the one system, two systems, one country that was entered into by China that was not to expire in 2047 is now gone by the boards. So the Chinese have violated this international agreement, which they made with the British. I'll never forget, wait a minute, hold on. I'm going to get my throat back. I'll never forget this meeting I had. You know, the 50-year relationship between China and Hong Kong is supposed to end in the year 2047. And I'll never forget my conversation with the head of the Chinese Securities and Exchange Commission. I was in Hong Kong. And I was interviewing a lot of guys, and one of the guys I interviewed was the head of the SEC, as we call it in America, the guy who supervised the stock market, about this relationship between one country, two systems. How was that going to work? What was going to happen? The guy looks at me and he says, this Hong Kong guy looks at me and he says, what we're working on here in Hong Kong is that in 2047, instead of China taking over Hong Kong is going to take over China. And in other words, that Hong Kong would bring the democracy and the freedom of speech that Hong Kong enjoyed to transform all of China rather than the other way around. And of course, China understood that and understood that's what all these demonstrations for democracy have been, and that they did represent a true danger to the future of the repression and autocracy of China. And so they enacted these new security laws, which have essentially eliminated freedom in Hong Kong. And it's just another example of the anger and the passion and the drive of China to achieve what it considers its rightful place in the world after the humiliations that is suffered over the centuries. And now the next target has been Taiwan. And China has been sending missiles across the straits into the waters around Taiwan as a warning to what could be the fate of Taiwan if it tried, in fact, to become truly independent and not consider itself part of China, but rather a totally independent country. And so there's so many examples of Chinese aggression that we have witnessed recently under Xi. And what's so interesting about that is, why is this happening? I mean, things going great in China, right? The economy is great. Exports are higher than they have been. They control the virus. I mean, why does he need all this international adventure stuff? And I tell you, it's because this sense of humiliation that China has never been allowed to achieve its rightful place in the world, its historically justifiable role, is driving China to take risks which I consider to be stupid and dangerous, especially when we have a stupid and dangerous president in the United States. So we now are into this terrible situation in which one country baits the other country, one country responds vigorously and vociferously against the actions of the other country, and there's a real risk of a significant confrontation between China and the United States, which would be total stupidity and total waste of time, in the sense of it's not the central agenda that either of our countries has. And I want to conclude this China discussion with just one more idea that I want you to know about, which is that Russia, between 1858 and 1860, seized huge amounts of territory from what was China at the time. All this pink stuff, the brown stuff and the pink stuff, were part of China. And what happened was the Tsar at the time decided he wanted to know what was going on in his eastern, in his far eastern territories, far Siberia. And you all know how big Russia is, and so there was very poor communication. There was no railroad. There was no telegraph at the time from Moscow out to here. And so he put together a exploration party, and they sent it out there, and the guys came back into Moscow and reported to the Tsar that there was all this territory out there that belonged to China. China had no army. It was there for the taking. If Russia could send an army out there, they could vastly increase the size of the Russian Empire. So the Tsar said, this is a great idea. I have no money. I don't know how to put together an army. What should I do? And what did his advisors say? You remember? Sell Alaska to the Americans. Alaska said, who needs Alaska? What the hell is in Alaska? It belonged to Russia at the time. So the Russians sold Alaska to America. The Americans bought Alaska. The Russians took the money, put together an army, went out into eastern Siberia and seized this territory from China. Since then, China has accepted the permanence of that new black border right above the word Manchuria. But I am telling you, this is going to be irksome to China over time. They will not be happy with the Russian seizure of this territory. This is another humiliation that a foreign power inflicted on China. Just like the British inflicted one, this is another one inflicted by Russia. And somewhere down the line, China is going to want to rectify this humiliation against Russia. So it's not in the cards right now because China and Russia share a hatred of the United States. But at some point, this is going to be an issue that's going to arise because it is another humiliation. Anyhow, I want you to know the way I see humiliation operating on China in order to be aggressive when otherwise everything seems so perfect for China. I'll stop and invite your comments and what do you think about China and any questions?
Professor, there's a question here. Now, so looking at the way things are going, is it fair for us to say that the presence of US in Southeast Asia is going to be pre-Vietnam War levels, and they're going to actually shift their focus from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia, and in doing so, gives a lot more access to Russia to do whatever they want in Eastern Europe?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Strategic thinkers in America have been saying for quite a while that there's a comparability between Great Britain and Europe and Japan and Asia. And one way to think about the comparability is that Britain is a permanently anchored aircraft carrier from which American forces can operate against Europe. And in the same sense, Japan is a permanently anchored aircraft carrier from which American forces can operate against Asia, which in this case, of course, means China. In the case of Britain, it of course means Russia. So there have been for many years the idea of moving American power to Japan to use it against China. And Prime Minister Abe, who's just stepped down in China, was in that sense a crucial ally of the United States because he was trying to increase Japan's own military capabilities and get over the self-imposed restrictions on the use of Japanese military imposed at the end of World War II. And so he's gone now, but it appears that his chief of staff, who has become prime minister, will assume the same role as Abe did when he was prime minister. So yes, there is this idea that on the one hand, the United States would shift its focus to Asia to counter China. On the other hand, the rise of Russian aggression, which I will come to later in my talk, gives pause to this idea because there is this fear that Russian aggression in the Middle East, where it has been most manifested recently, and Ukraine, won't be restricted to Ukraine and the Middle East, but will be extended, even possibility into Europe. So it's a challenge for the United States. And of course, President Trump doesn't understand any of this. This is beyond his capability of understanding. So for example, he had a personal humiliation with Chancellor Merkel, whom he felt did not treat him with the respect he deserved. In fact, she blew him off. And the result of that was he decided to pull US troops out of Germany in a completely impulsive, non-thoughtful, non-strategic way. And that he's done. So we're in the middle of struggling. We in the United States, I should say, are in the middle of struggling with this whole challenge of what to do about the balance between Russian aggression and Chinese aggression. Any other comments or questions?
Yes, Professor. So, Professor, what China has done to Taiwan, does India has done with the same thing with Kashmir?
And so,
do you see that this will have another impact in another 10 or 20 years, like what you have told, that there is some sort of personal things in the mind of Kashmiris that that they had that particularly after the abrogation of Article 370, that we have taken their freedom, and so it's a long lasting impact on them.
I'm very reluctant to comment on your country's actions, because I'm sure each of you understands them more profoundly than I do. But I was deeply concerned because the splitting of Kashmir into two parts and asserting new levels of Indian control over the Muslim population of Kashmir provides a further humiliation for the Muslim population of that region, plus a further humiliation of Pakistan, which sees itself as the rightful protectors, at least, of the people of Kashmir, and suggests to me a quite unnecessary provocation of the Muslim population of India. When you put that together with the ruling that refugees from neighboring countries who are Muslim are not entitled to Indian citizenship, and add that to the BJP Hindu nationalism, you get a story which does not contribute to long-term stability within India, driven by what I see as relatively short-term political goals. So I find it all quite disturbing. Now, that's my level of understanding of what's going on, and you may have a much more profound understanding of that than I do. Any comments or rebuttals to that idea? Let me move on to a couple of other examples of humiliation. So here is Vladimir Putin, and I already mentioned that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And here are two people, three people actually, as you can see. Alexei Navalny, poisoned on 20 August 2020 with Novichok, and Yulia and Sergei Skripal, poisoned in 2018. And Skripal, remember, was living in Great Britain. He had been a spy for the British in the Soviet Union, for which he was never forgiven by the Russian secret police. And he was poisoned with Novichok, and I think incidentally, it was not meant to be, but his daughter was also poisoned. And here is Navalny, the leading opposition figure to Putin in Russia, poisoned in 2020. So there's no doubt about this poisoning, because Novichok is not available at your local pharmacy in Moscow. You know, this is something that's tightly held by a Russian military. This is a Russian military poison that was created to be used in war. And the only explanation is that someone with access to Russian military equipment could have access to this poisoning, and it was done either directly by orders of the Kremlin or by someone high up in the authority, because no one else would take the risk of doing this. And of course, this is not the only person to have been poisoned. We know that Boris Nemtsov, who had been the deputy prime minister under Yeltsin, was killed on the bridge across the Moscow River on the way to the Kremlin. An unbelievable act, because there's so many cameras on those bridges that no one without official permission would have dared to have made a murder of an opposition figure that close to the Kremlin without some kind of official authorization. So there have been, we know, a very large number of the murder or attempted murder of opposition figures in Russia, the latest one being Navalny, now recovering in a Berlin hospital. So that the repression of people within Russia itself is really staggering, and it's clear that Putin wants to resurrect the good old days for him, which means Soviet oppression, utter ruthless control of the Russian people without the democracy that might lead to his losing power. And I think that's because he sees the history of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as such a personal humiliation of himself. And of course, you see what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. Here are the eastern provinces of Ukraine, as I mentioned, Lugansk and Donetsk, which are occupied by Russians. And then you see Crimea, where the Soviet naval base in the Black Sea at Sevastopol was located, seized in 2014. And just as an aside, on the left of this picture, you see Transnistria, which is this group of people who decided they didn't want to be part of Ukraine and didn't want to be part of Moldova. And there are Russian troops now posted in that area to prevent either Ukraine from taking over Transnistria or Moldovan troops from doing so. I visited these pink provinces in 1960, and the reason they're inhabited by Russians is that they were the major manufacturing heavy industry hub of Ukraine. And they, remember, there was not a real crucial distinction between Ukraine and Russia in the era we're talking about when there was a Soviet Union. And so major manufacturing plants were located in these areas east of Ukraine, right up against Russia. And Russians were sent to work in the factories of Ukraine. And this was started by Stalin, who, reindustrialized the Soviet Union in preparation for a war with Germany, which Stalin correctly understood was coming. And so that's how all these Russians ended up in eastern Ukraine, and that legitimated Russia under Putin from, in effect, seizing these territories away from the independent country of Ukraine. And of course, now, in September of 2015, Russia realized it had an opportunity to turn around the Syrian Civil War. And in September of 2015, they sent in the troops, preserving Bashar al-Assad's regime. Syria was always allied with Russia, which it saw as its best hope against Israel, because Syria, of course, was very weak. And indeed, the weakness of Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafez al-Assad, was demonstrated by the fact that by September of 2015, he was losing his authority and he was going to be defeated in the civil war. Russia sent in the troops and they preserved Bashar al-Assad. And now Syria is really a mess because we have ISIS, we have Iranian Shiite militias, we have American troops, we have Russian troops, we have Syrian Sunni troops all operating in Syria, and the country is devastated with tens of millions of refugees in other countries right now. And then, of course, now it's happened in Libya. So in 2011, there was an uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, sorry. And what happened was this gentleman who was shaking hands with the Russian foreign minister formed a country, Grand National Accord, the GNA, which is headquartered in Tripoli, the capital of Libya. But in the east of the country, a general who actually turned out to be a U.S. citizen because he fled Muammar Gaddafi, who was going to kill him, and he ended up living in Virginia, and he became a U.S. citizen. So Haftar has gone back to Libya, formed a militia in the eastern part of Libya, which is now supported by Russia. Turkey is supporting this guy shaking hands with the Russian foreign ministry. And Russia is preventing the unification of Libya by contributing to the militarization of General Haftar. So just another example of Russian aggression in making conflicts within the Middle East more serious than they have been. And in Iraq, just to stay with the Middle East for a minute, this American invasion of Iraq has been described by senior American military officers as the single most catastrophic foreign policy decision in the history of the United States. So here is the statue of Saddam Hussein being torn down, and on the other side you see the guy with the beard. He's the leading Shiite militia cleric in Iraq known as Ayatollah Sistani. And underneath that, you see a picture of Saddam with some military men. Well, the decision to invade Iraq was the greatest catastrophe in the history of American foreign policy. The second greatest catastrophic decision in the history of American foreign policy was the decision made on 23 May 2003 by the new American head of what was called the Coalition Provisional Authority, a guy named Paul Bremer, a guy I had known for many years, a total fucking jerk. And what decision did he make? He made the decision to disband Saddam's army, which was overwhelmingly made up of Sunnis, because remember, Saddam was a Sunni, and he was afraid of guys with the white beard, the Shiites, whom he felt as his natural enemies. So we disbanded the military of Iraq, leaving tens of thousands of Sunni military officers with military training and capabilities who felt humiliated not only by the defeat of Saddam himself, but then further humiliated by the disbanding of the military, sending them home, ending their lives. And the only meaning they had in their lives up until that point was the military. So what did they do? They formed ISIS, or Daesh, if you want to call it, the Islamic State. And so where did that come from? Came from a horrendously stupid decision by the United States, which drove these Sunni officers into a new form, ISIS. And we all know how destructive ISIS has been. You wonder where they got all these trucks, the Iraqi military. And so to this day, even though there's no territory that's really controlled by ISIS, the greatest threat to the integrity of both Syria and Iraq comes from the presence of these guys who are still rolling around in the deserts. And this was directly the result of this catastrophic American decision, inflicting humiliation on the Sunni military and then leading them to the formation of ISIS. So again, I want to stop here before I talk about Erdogan. Ask any questions?
Yes, Professor, may I go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in your slides, you have been speaking about humiliation, and that too, you have used the word perceived humiliation. So this sense of perception of humiliation at national levels is like historical wrongs. You may not be able to do away with it easily. But when I see it, the example that you mentioned about China and Russia, China doesn't direct its rage towards Russia over Manchuria, but rather it does it over Kashmir. That may be because of economic reasons. So my question is regarding the role of economics. So does that drive as a channel to channelize your rage, one, and second, at grassroots level, if there is decentralization, political, economic, and so on, does that take care of that rage? Because if people are not supporting the government, actual mobilization of rage may be restricted.
Those are good questions, very good questions, very important questions. And I do think the first, let me address the first question as I understood it, which is, if one is humiliated, how does one direct one's rage? What are the factors that lead to one's directing on rage? Well, if you look at what happens in the United States, I will make a generalization about the United States, which is a great generalization. In the first instance, people tend to direct their rage at the people who are closest to them. And that's why there's so much domestic conflict in the United States. So, for example, an individual who feels rage in the United States, having been humiliated at work, will come home, and there's a famous expression in America: you get humiliated at work, you come home and you kick the dog. It's the dog's fault. But a better example than that is you get humiliated at work and you come home and you kick your wife. If it weren't for her, everything would be great. I mean, this woman is always, you can just hear this guy going on and on and on. And divorce is very high in America for a lot of those reasons, because it's easy to kick your wife or your dog. Now, that's entirely different from a national. But if a leader wants to mobilize the population behind a campaign against something, he has to find an element which already resonates within the people. So Mr. Modi is really not going to be able to mobilize a lot of Indian public sentiment against Thailand. A lot of Indians have a lot of feelings about Thailand, but, we got other problems, Prime Minister Modi. We can't deal with Thailand. But getting people worked up about Muslims is obviously something that's easier to do and works better. Or against Pakistan, we know this is a great idea. And now against China, because of the so-called line of control. So it has to be something that resonates, that makes it easier. And economic issues are often part of that calculation. Now, wait a minute. What was the second question? Because it was also a really good question.
The second question was that if you in society implement decentralization in real sense, maybe political, economic, will that help control the rage? Because then people may not be mobilized for such false or historical wrongs, whatever it is, that old rage.
I think that's a very good point, but I think it's very hard to generate decentralization. One of the things that works in the United States is that we have 50 states, and that they have governments, and that they have tremendous leeway to try to see what works. So that we get, and some people have said there's like 50 experiments in democracy going on, and you can see which one works best. But the reality is that the national government in the United States has tremendous sway over public opinion and over power. And so, yes, I think decentralization is a factor which diminishes the capacity of a leader at the national level to mobilize the entire country, but it certainly doesn't eliminate it. That's what I would say. Yeah. Anything else? Well, let me talk a little bit about what's going on with President Erdogan of Turkey, and this is a perfect example of a president I'll come back. I just want to show you this first, and then I'll come back. Here is a chart of the increase in autocracy, at least as measured by something called the Varieties of Democracy Project, as you can see. And there's been an increase of autocracy in the United States. You see it down near the bottom of approaching 20%, and you can see India has been an increase of autocracy as measured by these guys above 30%, but nobody in the world has seen an increase in autocracy as has President Erdogan. And the question is, what's going on with Erdogan? Well, let me come back here. So here's one thing that's going on with Erdogan. You know, there's a history with Erdogan between Greece and Turkey that's gone on since the 20s. And it used to be the case, remember, that most of Western Turkey, where the word Turkey is, was entirely 100% Greek. And when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk won the war at the end of the First World War for the independence of Turkey and created the Republic of Turkey, millions of Greeks were expelled from Western Turkey and fled to Greece or to the islands immediately off the coast of Greece. And you can see all these blue islands, how close they are to the Turkish mainland, because once they got out of the Turkish mainland, they landed on these islands. Ataturk didn't have the capability of, seaborne assault vehicles that he was going to land on these islands and kick the Greeks out of these islands. So this is the way it looked for many, many years. And of course, what's the point now? As you can see in the bottom right, there's a Turkish ship exploring for natural gas because there have been huge finds of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. So at the bottom of the map here, you see Cyprus. And Cyprus has found a huge amount of natural gas. And below that, you would come to Israel and Egypt, both of which have found huge amounts of natural gas in the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean. And Turkey wants its share of the natural gas. The problem is, because Greece claims that every one of these islands off the Turkish coast has a sea shelf, which means that that island controls up to 12 kilometers or 12 miles, I should say, of sea around the island. There really is no place for Turkey to look for the natural gas that would otherwise be its own territory. There is no territory that's not claimed by Greece, you see. So Erdogan is absolutely apoplectic that Turkey, mind you, has no energy sources of its own. So it's really starved for energy, and everything it consumes in the way of energy, the basic issue of economic development, it imports. And so here is Greece, here is Israel, here is Egypt, suddenly acquiring huge amounts of natural gas, which is so immense that they're building a pipeline to Europe because they can't use all the gas that they themselves have found. So Erdogan is beside himself with that and is on the verge of some kind of military action. I mean, here's a more detailed map. You can see the area around Cyprus, which is mostly Greek controlled, if you like, and then underneath you see the various gas fields that Israel and Egypt have found, and Erdogan has responded with force. You can see in the bottom right, the white and red ship is the gas drilling ship, but it's surrounded by Turkish military vessels to protect it from Greek military vessels. And so this is a real source. It's a real source of conflict that may arise. And what is Erdogan humiliated about? Well, remember, he was refused admission to the European Union. The Europeans didn't want Muslims, and the Europeans didn't want to allow an increase in the sway of Muslims or the influence of Muslims or the number of Muslims into the European Union. And they ended up denying Erdogan the right to enter the European Union. So Erdogan turned his attention to the Middle East and returned to what was called an Ottoman foreign policy. Fuck the Europeans. We're going to work with the Middle East. And the response has been that Turkey's now involved with a lot of conflicts in the Middle East. One with the United States in Syria, conflict with Russia in Syria, conflict in Libya. And the list actually goes on, and Erdogan is angrier and angrier at his inability to do anything about the gas and to extricate himself. So one of his solutions, there have been two solutions so far. One is to increase the Islamization of Turkey. And here's just one symbol of Islamization of Turkey. Here is Mr. Erdogan with his beautiful wife, Emine, and you can see the way she is attired, that even one lock of hair is not allowed to be shown, because she is the exemplar of perfect Kurdish versions of appropriate Islamic dress for women. And of course, the other way is the one I mentioned, which is he's increasing the repression and the autocracy, with which he controls Turkey. So it's quite scary situation in which a man humiliated by Europe is on the verge of conflict. And just let me kind of conclude my remarks with a few words about Iran. So, this is what's happened to the Iranian currency. And you can talk about inflation. You can see what's happened to the Iranian rial. When I was there in January of '78, you came up with $1, you got 70 rials. 2012, you got 24,000 rials. In 2020, 269,000 rials. Imagine if you're an Iranian and you're worried about the collapse of your currency and you want to buy dollars as a safe haven against the further depreciation of the rial. You have to come up with 270,000 rial to buy $1. So you can see what's happened to people's currency and to what drives inflation in Iran, which is phenomenally high. And I don't want to detract from the role of American sanctions. I mean, they have been tremendously punishing and, in my view, entirely wrong-headed, I want you to know, because the people who are suffering in Iran are Iranians. Believe me, the guys who run the military, the economic elites, the so-called supreme leader, a jerk beyond measure. so-called supreme leader, they're not suffering. They get their caviar just like they used to in the old days. The people who are suffering are the people on the street. And that's all generated by mismanagement of Iranian economy by the Iranians, and then secondly by the horrendous sanctions. And so what's Iran's response? The Shiite belt. Iran's sudden decision to become aggressive in its foreign policy in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, and when it can get away with it on the eastern shores of Saudi Arabia, where there are a lot of Shiites. And so Iranian foreign policy, can you imagine? Iran is under sanctions. The oil exports have gone from like 3 million barrels a day to less than 400,000 barrels a day. The price of oil used to be $120 a barrel. It's now 42. So the quantity of oil has collapsed. The price of oil has collapsed. Iran is dependent on the price of oil for its revenues. And it's chosen this time to generate an aggressive foreign policy, which costs money, personnel, military supplies, and reputations. And it's like, what are they possibly thinking they could benefit from? And the answer is, this is their response to the humiliation they have suffered. And of course, the continued nuclear program, which you'll notice they have spread all over the country as a way of protecting nuclear sites from the possibility of US retaliation. They have enhanced their nuclearization. Now, think about the Iranian dilemma. What are they worried about? They're worried about Donald Trump's commitment to regime change. I believe that the purpose of the sanctions is Trump's belief that if the noose is tight enough, the Iranian people will rise up and overthrow the regime. I think this is 100% wrong. It is not going to happen. The regime has not lost its will to govern, nor has it lost the military capability to suppress the Iranian people. So the ones who are suffering are the Iranian people, and Trump is pursuing a stupid foreign policy. But if I were an Iranian, I would be very interested in what they call a screwdriver away from having a nuclear weapon, because that meant I could put together a bomb real fast if I felt that I was being threatened. So I see Iran's interest in nukes as a defense against American aggression. And the same thing goes with the missiles, which they continue to develop, which, remember, were not part of the JCPOA, the so-called nuclear agreement. And so this is the way Iran sees the United States, you know, that it's, the United States has a gun to the head of the Iranians. And I think that's pretty accurate. And this is what's happened to the oil production, as I mentioned earlier. Just plummeted. And this shows oil at about 2.7 million, falling to less than 400,000. So, and then finally, maybe the greatest humiliation in the Middle East. And you all know this story, and I just want to emphasize that the experience of the Arabs and of the Palestinians has been a profound, current, deepening sense of humiliation, only exacerbated by the willingness of the United Emirates to make a peace treaty with Israel in the last few weeks. And so the idea of the failure of the Arabs has been profound and profoundly humiliating. And for the time being, the only thing that this humiliation does is eats the Arabs alive, let me tell you. And I'm not going to go into this. I'm not going to go into this. And here's a wonderful quote from somebody in Cairo, which I think is absolutely right. They are oppressed, constrained, and unable to do anything, not by the Israelis any longer, by the Egyptian government. And what's the problem with the Arab world? The Arab world is living in another world. It's not living in the same world we're living in. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is from the United Nations Development Program. In the year 2000, fewer books were translated from foreign languages into Arabic that were translated from foreign languages into Greek. 300 million people speak Arabic, 11 people speak Greek. So the Arabs are in some way on a different planet, and their efforts to deal with their humiliations have failed, and the Arab world in general is a failure, and we will see much more conflict in the Middle East coming out of that, humiliation, which is certainly not run its course and will continue to harass us indefinitely. So this is, of course, I have a grammatical error here. A sense of having been humiliated is an important source of rage, which has frequently resulted in the country striking out. And so, again, I want to repeat that while humiliation is not the only factor, it's one of many in this idea of overdetermination. It's the one that's most often overlooked. And I hope as you go through your educations, as you prepare yourself for public policy, you'll keep in mind the role that humiliation plays and see ways in which you can moderate the pain of the humiliation so that it does not contribute to future conflicts. And in that regard, I wish you all the very best of good luck. So, thank you very much. Those are my remarks for today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zonis. This is definitely one of the most comprehensive lectures I've sat through in my life. I feel like I'm a world history expert just by having sat through in this 2-hour lecture. Thank you so, so much for having taken out the time and addressing the scholars.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I appreciate it. Thank you, Louis, for your lovely introduction. And I wish you all the greatest of success. Let me tell you something. India needs you. That's what I would tell you. So good luck.
Marvin, amazed that you could spend in your 80s 2 hours talking. So I can see some of the scholars looking tired, but you don't look it, except for your throat a bit. I don't know how you do it here.
I'm lucky.
Must be Lucy. Must be Lucy's great caring of you.
No question, my wife is keeping me alive and energetic. I'll tell her you pass that on. She'd like.
Okay, Marvin, we've got a couple of questions out of here. Is he gone off?
No, he's still here.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions. I don't know whether you have time to look at them at the bottom. I know people are tired, etc. But if you want to sort of just address a couple of the questions which some of the scholars have asked, maybe the last two.
How do I do that? Go to chat?
Oh, go to chat, yep, and you'll see them.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
Is it okay with you guys? Well, since you've asked the questions, I thought it'll be useful to get them here.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Kesava Balaji is asked about societies where the idea of self is community-based. In many ways, you see, if there's a communal self, mobilizing that community for action after a perceived communal humiliation is much easier than in an individualistic society. Thus, for example, Erdogan has been more successful in mobilizing the Muslims of Turkey than it is easy to mobilize Americans. Because Americans, they're all individuals. Don't tell me about these African Americans. What do I care about African Americans? I'm a white guy who lives in North Dakota. I have nothing to do with, there are no African Americans around me. I couldn't care less. But when it's communal based, and when people have a sense of connection to a larger entity than themselves or their individual selves, then this can be used, I believe, more effectively to mobilize people in the event of a humiliation, right? Yeah, Bangladesh's increase is higher than India. That's really important. Well, when you look there's an interesting question here. What does it say about the EU's conception of regionalism, like Germany and France? And I think what the question is referring to is that in some important way, the European Union is made up of regions rather than countries. And individual countries are divided up into regions, and the aid from the European Union goes to the regions of countries who are above or are below the average well-being of all the regions of the European Union, and that's how they allocate development funds. However, that really doesn't work for anything other than development funds, because the reality is nationalism is very powerful, and we can see Germany's unwillingness, for example, to assume responsibility for the debt burdens of what they consider to be the irresponsible South, who goes around spending much more money than the responsible North, that means Germany, allows itself to spend. So I think it's not, regionalism is not really as powerful in Europe as we think. And on the question of Nord Stream, well, I think the export of natural gas by Russia is crucial to its survival as a country. And in that sense, it will put every possible resource into perpetuating this Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the completion of the pipeline into Germany, which I see not so much as a strategic gain for Russia, but as an economic gain for Russia. If you look at the Russian economy, it's pathetic. I mean, how many of you guys are driving Russian cars? Probably not too many. And so Russia is essentially an oil and gas exporting country. It's a gas station. That's what it is, It sells natural gas, it sells oil, and nothing else is going on. And Putin has utterly failed to transform the Russian economy from a natural gas and oil exporter into an industrial powerhouse. And it's really quite pathetic. And so the Nord Stream 2 is crucial to the economy of Russia and its sustainability, and they will do whatever they can to have it happen. And I think that probably Germany appreciates that, and it will not feel what Donald Trump thinks it should feel, which is strategic pressure, as much as it will see it as an economic opportunity to get cheap natural gas from Russia. And so I think that's probably going to go on, and the Germans aren't going to be taken in by that. Yeah, India's historic stand in the Arab world. Well, what's the reason? Why did the UAE sign this deal with Israel? And there's a couple of interesting answers to that. One is Israel and the UAE are both afraid of Iran. Is that fear legitimate? Maybe. Number two, the UAE has been trying to buy advanced weapons from the United States to defend itself against Iran, because remember, the UAE is an island of both stability and military and economic well-being in an otherwise very rocky area. And Netanyahu has had a veto over US sales of advanced military hardware to the UAE, because Netanyahu has always feared that the UAE would get this military hardware and then give it to some Arab state to use against Israel. So the UAE, in order to get to buy this stuff, had to convince Netanyahu to allow the United States to sell the stuff to them. And what did Netanyahu get? Netanyahu is an indicted criminal, remember, by the Israeli Supreme Court. Netanyahu got the gratitude of the United States and the recognition of Israel by an important Arab state, not important in terms of the size of its population, but this is the first Arab country to really modernize and get with the 20th century. And I gave you some statistics about other Arab countries where they're at. And the UAE is really hip, relatively speaking, not democratic in any way. But so that was the trade-off, and Trump comes out looking good as if he had anything to do with all this, which he didn't. And so the reality is, I think the factors that have led India to favor the Arab world are weakening as much as the factors that led the UAE to favor the Arab world are weakening. The reality is Israel is a developed country with huge economic benefits and tremendous talent in all of the modern sectors of an economy, and it's become a wealthy country. And as the issue of Muslims has declined in India, for the present government, the natural ally of India is becoming Israel and not Jordan or Egypt or even Saudi Arabia. I'm going to have to sign off now.
Thanks a lot, Marvin. Thanks for the extra time. And well, look forward to seeing you in Chicago someday.